All right. Now, the title of my paper is Still a Cold Monster, interrogation mark, on the dual nature of the state. Now, the question of the state, of its legitimacy and its form, might be considered as nearly the whole business of political and legal philosophy. But it has, moreover, a strong existential relevance. Our entire life is developed and experienced within state walls. We were born and immediately we were registered as members, nationals of a state. Our minute affairs and vicissitudes are driven by state rules and instructions. We are under state supervision and control from birth to death. If we infringe the state rules and instructions, we are sent to state jails, or we have to pay state fines. And the substantive part of our income is every year taken by state through taxes. If it is possible that many Europeans were not aware to live under a state till 1914, but suddenly in the August of that fatal year, they were summoned to be conscripted, sent first to barracks, given a uniform and a weapon, carried by trains to the front, and pushed there to kill each other without clearly understanding the reason of such massacre. In several European states, the military training was anticipated in the public school, a place where children and teenagers were confined at least 5 hours every day and subject to a strict discipline and a strong indoctrination. The schoolmaster anticipated the figure and the role of the sergeant, putting them in ranks and ordering them to jump out of the trench to fight the enemy. National identity was a product of the emergency of states, not its mother. Possibly the same holds true for the birth of free market economy. A state, as a matter of fact, was a gigantic enterprise of making out of plural belongings a homogeneous national practice. Until late in the 20th century, for instance, Italian peasants could not generally understand each other since they didn't share a common national language. They spoke their respective dialects. Sicilian peasants could hardly have grasped what a working-class girl from Piedmont had to say. Those plural and diverse communities were only sharing the same experience of being subject to an overwhelming force that intended to shape their lives in a uniform way. The state thus strongly simplified the internal structures of political orders, while at the same time bringing about a new dimension of plurality and indeed, paradoxically, producing anarchy within interterritorial, intergovernmental relations. Now, what is indeed the state? Which is its nature? In which way we could define it? There are at least two traditional definitions. There are two traditional definitions. There is one focusing on the exercise of violence within a discrete territory. The state would be basically qualified by monopoly of violence. This does not mean that violence is the ordinary means for the state to act and exist. However, adds Max Weber, the great sociologist, it is what gives the state its specificity. It is what defines its nature. Monopoly of force is a somehow indeterminate notion. How should we understand it? We could think of such monopoly as a device to reduce or minimize violence. Indeed, there is a line of interpretations that see the state as the engine of a process of civilization within societies, whereby people have to learn to relate the one to the other without violence. No vengeance is now allowed when one's own interests are harmed by a third person. No feuds are tolerated. Only the state, that is, its officials, can hold a weapon against a human being. And only in the shape of a legal sanction, of a punishment, or of a constraint against disobedience to state rules, or against the private, illegitimate use of force. On the other hand, the monopoly of violence formula might imply an alternative narrative. What the state in this second approach can undertake is a superior use of violence, such as to bend the rest of the use of violence in society. In a sense, here the state, by arrogating to itself supremacy and sovereignty, means that it's being able to be the most violent possible actor within society. So monopoly of violence in this second approach means that the state is able of the most violent expression of force. There is no other actor in society that might be more violent. In order to do that, means should be used that are the strongest and the most effective for deploying force. The force is concentrated not so much to deactivate it. The force is concentrated not so much to deactivate it, but rather to make it possible an extreme use of it. This logic is then duplicated in the arena of international relations, where a search for equilibrium of powers among states is every time disrupted by the state striving to have military supremacy over its rivals. According to this picture, states do not seem to be instrumental in civilizing social and political relations. It may seem, on the contrary, that they render the social world increasingly dependent on and exposed to extreme violence. Indeed, after the discovery of weapon of mass destruction to total annihilation. But the question remains, what is the state? Legal philosophy and legal theory have usually given two answers to this question, once again testifying the duality of state nature, or the ambiguity of its grip on our society and imagination. The key to the understanding of the state here is seen in its connection to law. What is law for the state, or vice versa, what is the state for the law? Here, two opposed visions are confronted. First, we have an approach according to which the state is, as such, an extra legal entity, a body that is able to act collectively and is hierarchically structured with a commander-in-chief on its highest rank. A state, according to this vision, is either a sovereign power that can impose obedience on others, a so-called political superior. The state is prior to the law. It is indeed the source of law, and the efficacy of law is indeed limited in shaping the essentials of the state. The state operates legally by an act of self-limitation. This view has relevant implications in the way we should then understand constitutionalism and the nature of a constitutional state. In this essentialist approach, the state is not the product of a constitution. The latter can only give, the constitution can only give some form to the state. It offers formalisms of various kinds to its operations, formalisms, however, that when needed can be dismissed. For such view, there is a continuity of the state that constitutions cannot alter. The basic nature of what the state is and remains, the basic nature of what a state is and remains the same whatever constitution is then adopted. Fundamental rights here can never be rooted in original natural freedoms of citizens or in their basic moral dignity. However, there is an alternative doctrine. The state is a collective entity that is structured through legal rules, says this alternative doctrine. This view is then radicalized by Hans Kelsen, the most influential jurist of the 20th century. A state, he claims, cannot be understood, nor can it act without referring to rules. And within the state, rules are equivalent to legal rules. There is no possibility of conceiving an acting state from any other perspective once we assume the internal point of view of its agents. This is the legal point of view. The consequence of such approach is that every state is considered to be a rule of law. Rule of law and state rule are one and the same thing. This thesis, however, does not have prima facie strong legal, philosophical, or political implications. Kelsen is not in this way recommending a dictatorship as a rule of law. Nonetheless, the substantive emptiness, the radical formalism of this approach contrasts with any attempt to offer a substantive picture of the state. On the other hand, this approach allows for the idea that sovereignty is another name just for a valid legal order, and that law can be perfectly impersonated through supranational institutions. In the end, Kelsen's message is that law is independent from the state as a specific sociological formation, or alternatively, that the state is just another name for whatever valid legal order. Here, the duality of the state is being, on the one hand, a historical community, a special sort of society, and on the other, a formal hierarchical structure defined by rules and procedures, is solved by simply denying that we are here facing a problem. There is indeed no solution of the state dual nature dilemma offered by Kelsen, but only a denial of the problem, seen as arising from an unclear or mistaken epistemological strategy. The only cognitive point of view concerning a state, he says, is the internal one, the legal perspective. Beyond this, or without this, there is confusion and inappropriate essentialism or even mysticism, as it happens, for instance, whenever the state is interpreted with reference to an impersonal soul or a collective destiny, and is filtered through a demanding philosophy of history or a too thick social ontology. But is Kelsen's thesis informative enough about what a state really is? We might doubt it is. The Austrian scholar does not ignore the coercive side of the state practice And indeed, according to him, a legal order is a coercive system. And legal norms have a basic subject to deal. Legal norms have as a basic subject to deal with sanctions and coercion. But coercion as such cannot yet give us the nature of law, nor can it explain the state and its operation and validity. Otherwise, a bandit's order, a rule by desperados or gangster or mafia, would be indistinguishable from law or from the state. Or we could even envisage Auschwitz as an institution of law. By the way, according to Kelsen, it is validity, a normative, not empirical dimension, the specific form of the existence of both law and state. There is in the state much more than just monopoly of violence, much more than just monopoly of violence. There is a drive to order and structure and process conducts. State, thus, is a legal monopoly of violence, where the legal attribute is what gives the state its specific nature and ontological justification, if we need one. But is this reference to legality a sufficient guarantee for the taming of violence in the case of state practice? It might be contested. In the end here, the factual prevails. This is somehow explicit in Kelsen's admission that the basic ground rule of the legal order is the efficacy principle, one that is recurrent in public international law, and that instructs to consider the state that is as the legitimate legal subject of international law, such that it deserves recognition by the international community, all those powers that have fully effective control within a specific territory. This idea, we might remember, is quite close to the Pascal, the French philosopher, recommendation that since we cannot make just powerful, we should acknowledge the powerful to be just. According to this view, a violence that is effective and monopolized by a powerful subject can legitimately raise a claim to legality. But is this coherent with the notion of state as a civilizing actor in society? Is the state a gentle civilizer of nations once it is shaped according to the facticity of an irresistible power? Well, this is objected by Gustav Radbruch, a German jurisprudent. Radbruch, I must confess that I like Radbruch very much, but this is a different story. Radbruch is a legal positivist. He was also Ministry of Justice during the Weimar Republic. He was also a member of the Socialist Party, SPD. But he was a legal positivist, strongly legal positivist. He uses the doctrine of the self-limitation of the state as starting point. Law is the outcome of a self-limiting act. But law's efficacy is conditioned to an application of the rule, of the legal rule, that is universally undertaken. A self-limitation by law means that law is applicable to the state itself. Of course, in this perspective, there is a state before law. But the state's claim to make law, and this is a necessary evolutionary move for the state to develop its grip on society, is only possible under the condition of a law that is generally applicable, that is applied to the state itself. Law does not provide an exception for the state. A state without a law is illegal and thus illegitimate. But this opens to a full deployment of the dual nature of the state, insofar as the law sense is envisaged in its claim to justice. A legal state, a Rechtsstaat, says Radbruch, is a state that raises a claim to justice. However, the question is intricate, and the legal positivists maintain as general doctrine of law makes things less clear and less promising. Radbruch maintains the idea of a sovereign power that imposes, possibly by coercion, its rules, and the justification it has is essentially given by this capacity of being a supreme authority. This meant in factual terms, at the end of the day, as violence and, once again, as a monopoly of force. Legal positivism, that is, the doctrine according to which law validity is not necessarily connected with justice or morality, is a theory especially designed, legal positivism is a theory especially designed to justify the rise of modern state. So there is a strong connection. I wouldn't say conceptual, but I would say certainly historical connection between state and legal positivism. As a matter of fact, in the philosophy of law, legal positivism has been identified along distinct versions. We have first a doctrine that claims the state to be the only source of law. The only source of law. It is the state. This is sometimes also called the source thesis. The law is to be known just by looking at what an authority, a state, says the law is. This thesis, that of the state as the only producer of law, is made plausible through the adoption of two more basic versions of positivism. The first is the so-called methodological positivism, which says it is possible to know what valid law is in a descriptive, purely cognitive mood. So in order to know what the law to apply is, I just have to identify the source, and I describe it, and I have the rule for the case. So the normative is reduced to a kind of, let's say, registration of a fact, of a source. This is this is kind of an epistemological rehearsing of the source theory. There is somewhere a source of law. I approach it, I see it, I record it, and this is all I need to know what the law is. I do not need to assume a normative attitude. I should be neutral. I should only, repeat, sing the law's prescriptions. A lawyer should only learn them possibly by heart. Indeed, should learn to sing them, repeat such rules once and again. But why should we have such source, such prescriptions, a sovereign establishing what the law is? Here we step into the so-called normative positivism, the definitive version of positivism. So the definite, because in order to justify that I have to look at the source, I should justify why I should look at the source. This is the fundamental problem in the end. And so that the fundamental version of legal positivism in the end is not epistemological, but is fully ideological, normative. This version of legal positivism says the following. In a society, there is a permanent conflict of positions and views and attitudes about what the binding social rules should be. Such conflict is irresolvable from the point of view of substantive morality. This is so especially because the right and the wrong are relative, and cannot be cognitively approached. There is no possible objective justification for a just solution. The one right answer is only a noble dream, whenever it does not take the contours of a nightmare. What is right then cannot but be the outcome of a decisionist action, undertaken by a figure that has the authority, the force, that can use the necessary violence to impose the one solution that ends the controversy. And we need it if we want to live in peace and coordinate our conduct effectively. A somehow oblique version of this normative positivism has been recently offered by the so-called service conception of the authority developed by Joseph Raz, an Oxford Don. Here the positivist approach is dressed as a logical or even an ontological argument, and the argument runs more or less as follows. Since the law is something that claims authority, it does presuppose such authority. That is a coercive power capable of imposing its prescriptions. And this is the nature of law. Behind such ontological or conceptual proof of authority as the nature of law, there is presupposed the theory of the reasons we have for action. In this case, the argument runs more or less as follows. Authority issuing preemptive second-order reasons for action is able to give first-order reasons for action, that is, individual preferences and basic interests, a better satisfaction. First-order reasons are better placed to be realized if they are assisted by second-order reasons. But, and this is the gist of the argument, such assistance is here equivalent to replacement. Preemption, second-order reasons replace, preempt first-order reasons, and it is good that it is so. To do that, to have such preemptive action, however, there should be an authority issuing those second-order reasons. That is an intervention that preempts first-order reasons, that is individual substantive desires and preferences, and make them irrelevant in the practical reasoning of citizens. Authority, this is moreover the basic justification for such operation. Authority, which is the basic justification for such operation, makes people better off. Authority makes people better off. This is the thesis. And this is only possible if, in confronting the authority rules, people forget the relevance and even the content of their first-order reasons, that is, of their interests, needs, and preferences. Before rules as second-order reasons, that is, as authority commands, because in the end, what are these second-order reasons? Just commands, imperatives, prescriptions. We are asked to forget, so before commands by the authority, we are forced to forget that the underlying good, these reasons, such commands, are supposed to assist and better realize. Now, legal positivism tends to obscure in this way, the dual nature of law and state. Authority is the core of law and state in such perspective, and behind authority lurks the experience of the monopoly of violence meant as the extreme possible force deployable. However, Gustav Radbruch, as we have seen, proposes a richer concept of law and legality, connected as this is to justice. He makes positive reductionism less plausible and opens up to an alternative theory. This alternative, surprisingly enough, has been openly thematized by an anarchist thinker, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. We are used to believe that anarchism is the doctrine that more radically opposes the state. Indeed, for most anarchist thinkers, the state is irremediably considered as a matter of violence and domination. The qualifying character of a state is assumed to be its use of violence and the reduction of people in principle to sort of slaves, to subjects that are fully disposable by power holders. This is also the anarchist Russian Prince Kropotkin's view, whose book on the state centers around the hypothesis of this political form as an outcome of sheer violence and oppression. However, there is an anarchism that is less radical or, if you like, more sophisticated on this point. This is defended by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a 19th century French political theorist. Proudhon considers the state from two opposite perspectives. We can have the state as just monopoly of violence, where the claim to justice is nearly null, or if there is, it plays just a role of an ideological fiction. Here, force and violence are the definitional properties for a state. However, says Proudhon, there is another sense of state, which is both less formal and less sheerly empirical. And that is the state as the dimension of public affairs, of common good, res publica. The common good is another name of the justice of political life, of the public morality of collective institutions. In this sense, a state is that sphere where individuals are no longer considered as isolated subjects, stripped of their social context, of their intersubjective attachments, of the reciprocity of commitments that makes their identity. In this area, the public is equivalent, or might be equivalent, to reciprocity and solidarity. The state locus would then be public morality and the common good, not violence. Michael Oakeshott, a British conservative, seems to follow Proudhon's suggestion in this book on human conduct, a beautiful book, when he proposes two possible declinations of the idea of state, actually quoting Proudhon. One that he calls societas, another one labeled universitas. Universitas' main character is its purposiveness, its instrumental strategic determination, whenever associates are driven by uniform external target. For instance, a multinational, a company. This is universitas. Societas is rather a mode of internal discursive recognition and conversation. Oakeshott then adds that modern states are a conjunction of both models. They are mixed up, but such mixing is never fully achieved, made coherent. The two basic ideas can hardly be converging into a congruent, frictionless scheme. We could nonetheless hope, and this is my conclusion, of course this should be further developed, I understand that. We could nonetheless hope that one model, and the more civilized one, that of the state as public sphere and discourse, might eventually prevail. The state is reshaped in terms of an institution of social solidarity and civil conversation. Here, justice, moreover, assumes a strong redistributive turn, by at the same time referring it to the citizen's sovereignty. In this second view of the state, as an institution of public discourse and solidarity, there are no commands and subjection as original positions, and they do not have definitional character. What is essential in such case is engaging with commitments and agreements. Authority is here prompt by citizenship and participation. First order reasons take the upper hand. First order reasons, so the interest in individual preferences, take the upper hand over the second order state precepts. Law is given back to justice consideration, and this to the collective solidarity of people that acknowledge each other, basic needs, rights, and virtues. My conclusion: coercion is thus bound, civilized, instead of being unleashed, as it is, at the end of the day, the last word of legal positivism. Thank you.